Hello everyone, welcome to the one-shot revision class for breathing and exchange of gases. Here we will be focusing on the important concepts as per NEET preparation. So before we understand the concepts in details, let's see the high PYQ areas. These are the high PYQ areas from respiratory volumes and capacities. You can focus on formula, numerical and definition based questions. For diffusion of gases, you should remember what is the partial pressure values for both oxygen and carbon dioxide in tissues, deoxygenated and oxygenated blood, direction of diffusion, why carbon dioxide diffuses faster than oxygen. Okay. Then for oxygen dissociation curve, what is the nature of the curve, how the curve shifts with respect to the different parameters like carbon dioxide, H plus ions, temperature, where does hemoglobin bind to oxygen and where does it dissociate, and what are the factors contributing to it. So these assertion based question or conceptual questions come from this topic. Okay, next topic is transport of carbon dioxide. What are the percentage in which carbon dioxide is transferred is important. Importance of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Okay, and what are the factors that affect it, those are important for this topic. Coming to regulation of respiration, mostly fact based questions on centers of regulation is important. Then let's see moderate level PYQ areas, that is mechanism of breathing and anatomy. For mechanism of breathing, you have to pay attention to what are the pressure changes during both inspiration and expiration process, role of the diaphragm and the different muscles in breathing, and mostly you can expect assertion based question from this topic. From anatomy based, you can pay attention to epiglottis, alveoli, pleura, and you have to identify the structure and function of these. Okay, mostly location based question on the conducting part and exchange part can also be expected. Then low PYQ but very scoring topic, that is disorders, respiratory disorders, directly fact based questions come from here. Okay, so after understanding the high PYQ areas which is helpful for NEET preparation, let's now see the concepts in detail. Breathing is just the exchange of the gases, that is physically we are exchanging gas, we are taking in oxygen and releasing out carbon dioxide. That process is called as breathing, and you should know that breathing is not the same as that of cellular respiration where in we break down the nutrients to release energy. And why we need breathing? Because oxygen is needed for breakdown of the food material and carbon dioxide, which is a waste product, needs to be eliminated. So to maintain the metabolic process, breathing is very essential. Now, if we see different organs that are present in organisms across the evolution, now the simple organisms such as sponges and coelenterates, they respire by their body surface and exchange the gases with the surrounding water, and the method is by the simple diffusion method. Okay, now if you see earthworms, now earthworms to perform the gas exchange through the thin moist skin layer or cuticular respiration. Okay, this has also come in previous year NEET exam. Now, if you consider higher organisms such as insects, insects use tracheal tubes which are nothing but a network of air-filled tubes that directly deliver oxygen to the tissues. So, insects have tracheal tubes for the respiratory purpose. Now, aquatic arthropods and mollusks, if you see, they have specialized structures for extracting dissolved oxygen from water, or these possess specialized gills in them. Okay. Coming to terrestrial vertebrates, they respire from lungs and which has like a wide range of internal respiratory surface wherein exchange of gases can take place. Now, amphibians are very interesting here. They possess dual respiratory system. Okay, in the aquatic system, they can respire through skin or perform cutaneous respiration, and they also have lungs for the terrestrial respiration. Okay. Next topic is structure of human respiratory system. It comprises of two parts. Okay, conducting part, exchange part. What is the function of conducting part? It transports the air from atmosphere, removes foreign particles and humidifies it. And what is present inside it? The external nostrils are present, the nasal chamber, then pharynx, which is the common passage of food and air. Then you have larynx. Larynx contains your sound box. Then you have trachea. Trachea consists of cartilaginous rings which are incomplete C-shaped rings, and they maintain the airway patency while allowing esophageal expansion. When we eat food, esophagus expands and the patency of the trachea is maintained by the C-shaped cartilaginous rings. Okay. Now, this trachea at the level of fifth thoracic cavity divides into left and right bronchi. Okay. These bronchi further divide into bronchioles, and terminal bronchioles give rise to the alveolar duct and alveoli. Okay. These alveoli and alveolar ducts, these are the actual parts responsible for the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide and comprise of the exchange part of the respiratory system. Is that clear? Now, you have one important structure here which is epiglottis. Epiglottis is an elastic cartilaginous flap and it prevents food from entering the respiratory system typically larynx during swallowing. During swallowing, if the food enters the airway, it should be a problem. That's why we have epiglottis which prevents the food from entering the air pathway. Also, the lungs, they consist of double membrane called as the pleura. See, the lungs, it has double membrane which is called as the pleura, and inside this pleura you have the pleural fluid. Now, what is the function of pleural fluid? It reduces the friction during the breathing movements. So for respiratory system, you should remember what are the anatomical structure, what is inside the conducting part, what is inside the exchange part, and function of the typical parts. That is important. Okay. So until now you are clear about the structure of the human respiratory system. Let's see what is the mechanism of breathing. Now, breathing comprises of inspiration or inhalation and expiration or exhalation. So, inspiration is nothing but atmospheric air which is taken inside, that is called as inhalation, and the air present inside the lungs or the alveolar air, when it comes out, it is called as the expiration. Okay, the basic mechanism behind it is the difference in the pressure or the pressure gradient. Let's see in detail inspiration first. Now, in case of inspiration, the diaphragm, which is a dome-shaped structure, it contracts. And this contraction increases the length in the anterior posterior axis. Okay, this diaphragm contracts and it moves downwards. Okay, when you breathe in, you feel your diaphragm uh, goes downwards, it flattens, and this results in the increase in the anterior posterior length. And then what happens? The external intercostal muscles contract. In the ribs you have external intercostal muscles, they contract, due to which what happens, the length along the dorsoventral axis increases. So because of combining effect of the diaphragm contraction and the contraction of external intercostal muscles, the overall volume of the thoracic cavity increases. And when the overall volume increases, the intrapulmonary pressure or the pressure inside the lungs decreases. Right? When volume increases, pressure decreases. We all know Boyle's law. So as the pressure decreases, it creates a negative pressure inside the lungs. So air should always come from the positive pressure towards the negative pressure. So atmospheric air rushes inside and fills up the lungs. Is that clear? Let's now see expiration. Now in case of expiration, what happens? The diaphragm, which had contracted in inspiration, it comes back to its original dome shaped. Okay, it was flat in inspiration, it becomes dome shaped. Okay, and moves up. Now when it moves up, there is decrease in the anterior posterior axis length. Okay, also the near the ribs you have external intercostal muscles, they also relax. Okay, this relaxation, it decreases the length along the dorsoventral axis. So combining result, thoracic volume decreases. When volume decreases, obviously the intrapulmonary pressure increases. So what happens? The air moves from the high pressure inside the lungs towards the outside. So air is expelled from the lungs. Is that clear? This is the mechanism of respiration. Now what are the key muscles that play a role? Diaphragm, which contracts in inspiration and relaxes in expiration. External intercostal muscles, which contracts in inspiration and it relaxes in expiration. Also in the forced expiration, you have internal intercostal muscles which play a role, right? There are some facts about the breathing. If you see, the normal rate of breathing is 12 to 16 breaths per minute. It's a data which you need to remember. And forced breathing also involves abdominal muscles for deeper breaths during the exercise or stress condition. Okay, another fact-based question is on spirometer, which is a clinical instrument used for measuring lung volumes and capacities, or the volume of air involved in breathing. Right? So here you should pay attention to the pressure changes during the breathing and the muscles which are involved in the process of inspiration and expiration. Concept-based as well as fact-based questions can come from here. Next topic is respiratory volumes and capacities. Okay. Now, this is a very important PYQ topic, and here you should remember the definition of it, a formula for it, as well as specific volumes for the what is the exact volume for the respiratory volume as well as capacity. Also, you can expect numerical questions from here. Okay. Now, let's see what are respiratory volume. Now, under a specific breathing state, whatever amount of air you can inhale or exhale, that is called as respiratory volume. What is a breathing state? Like if you are relaxed or and when you are exercising, both the states you will inhale different amount of air or exhale also different amount of air. So in typical breathing state, whatever volume of air you are inspiring in or expiring out, that is called as the respiratory volume. Clear? What is respiratory capacity? Respiratory capacity means when we add two or more respiratory volumes, then we get respiratory capacity. Let's now look at respiratory volumes. Okay, you are in a normal breathing state. You are very relaxed. You are breathing in very normally, breathing out very normally. The amount of air which or the volume of air inspired or expired in a normal breath is called as the tidal value. This is your tidal volume. This tidal volume is equal to 500 milliliter. This is called TV. Okay. Now you are watching TV, relaxing, so that is your tidal volume. Okay. Now see, if you want to exercise, you need extra air, you want extra air. So the additional volume of air inspired by forceful inspiration, this is your additional volume of air which you can inspire forcefully. That is called as the inspiratory reserve volume. That is equal to 2500 to 3000 milliliter. Clear? Now, suppose you want to expire. Now, how much air you can forcibly expire? Like how much air you can forcibly exhale out, that is called as expiratory reserve volume, and it is equal to 1000 to 1100 milliliter. Okay. Now, there is something called as residual volume or RV. Now, even though you expire out forcibly, there is some amount of air that is still remaining in the lungs. Why? Because in order to maintain the alveolar structure so that they don't stick together, we need some air to be present inside them, right? So that is referred to be as residual volume. Volume of air remaining in lungs even after a forceful expiration is called as residual volume and is equal to 1100 to 1200 milliliter. So this is the volume, respiratory volume, which cannot be measured by spirometer. Very important, because we can indirectly calculate it, but we cannot measure it directly because this doesn't come out, right? So it is always present inside the lungs. So this is your residual volume. Okay. Now let's see capacities. Now, first one is inspiratory capacity. Inspiratory capacity is equal to TV or the tidal volume plus the IRV. TV plus IRV together makes up your inspiratory capacity. That is nothing but the total air volume which can be inspired after a normal expiration. Normal expiration you have done, how much air you can inspire in? Obviously, normal volume, that is the tidal volume, plus the extra, that is the inspiratory reserve volume. So IC is equal to TV plus IRV. Okay. Now let's see expiratory capacity. What is expiratory capacity? Expiratory capacity means maximum volume of air expired after a normal inspiration. How much volume of air you can maximum expire out or exhale out? That is equal to tidal volume plus the expiratory reserve volume. Is that clear? Tidal volume plus the expiratory reserve volume is equal to EC. Okay. Next is functional residual capacity or FRC. That is nothing but volume of air remaining in lungs after normal expiration. If you normally expire, how much volume of air we can normally expire? We know it is a tidal volume. So the functional residual capacity is how much ever volume of air we can forcefully expire, or ERV plus reserve volume, which is always present in the lung. So FRC is equal to ERV plus RV. Okay. Now we have vital capacity. Vital capacity is nothing but IRV plus TV plus ERV. Very, very important. IRV plus TV plus ERV is called as the vital capacity. What is it? Vital capacity is the maximum volume of air that can be expired out after a maximum inspiration. You have done a maximum inspiration, how much volume of air you can expire out? The tidal volume will come, and extra air which we have inspired in the IRV plus ERV, forcefully how much ever we can give out, that is the taken together. Vital capacity is equal to VC is equal to IRV plus TV plus ERV. Is that clear? Next we have total lung capacity. That is the total volume of air the lungs can hold after maximum inspiration. That is nothing but VC plus the reserve volume. That is your total lung capacity. Now you should remember that the vital capacity, they are not calculated from a single breath. Okay. You can calculate the respiratory volumes from breath, but not respiratory capacities. Respiratory capacities are typically obtained by adding the different respiratory volumes. Okay, so just remember, inspiratory capacity and expiratory capacity is easy. For vital capacity, you can remember forceful inspiration. You have done, how much volume of air you can expire out. That is VC is equal to IRV plus TV plus ERV. TV will be already there. Maximum you have inhaled in, so IRV will come, and how much you can forcibly give out, that is ERV. So VC plus reserve volume, when you get the total lung capacity. They are very important for like checking the functionality of the lungs. I hope it's clear. So in previous slides, we discussed about the mechanism of respiration or breathing. Okay. Now let us see what is the mechanism of gaseous exchange. That is how oxygen and carbon dioxide are being exchanged. Now the process, if we see, it is because of the process of simple diffusion. What is diffusion? Particles moving from high concentration towards a low concentration. This process is known as diffusion. So what is the driving force? What is the reason behind the transport of the gases? That is because of the difference in the concentration gradient or the pressure gradient of the respective gases. Okay. The primary site at which this gaseous exchange takes place is the alveoli in the lungs, and secondary site is between the blood and the tissues. The various factors that affect this diffusion rate are the pressure gradient, that is the difference in the partial pressure for both oxygen and carbon dioxide. Solubility. Second factor is solubility. If we see carbon dioxide is 20 to 25 times more soluble as compared to oxygen in blood. So what will happen? Carbon dioxide will diffuse in a very faster rate for a unit difference of pressure. That means if let us say there is a pressure difference of 5 millimeter Hg, then the amount of carbon dioxide that will diffuse in the blood is comparatively very high in compared to the oxygen. Okay. The third factor that affects the diffusion rate is membrane thickness. That is, if there is thin membrane, then the diffusion of the membrane, diffusion of the gases across the membrane is very high. So three factors: pressure gradient, solubility of gases, and membrane thickness. Then second thing is what is partial pressure. Now when we inhale air, that comprises a mixture of gases, that is oxygen and carbon dioxide both in it. So the pressure that is contributed by an individual gas in a mixture of gas, that is known as partial pressure. So we have a mixture of carbon dioxide and oxygen. Now individually, how much pressure carbon dioxide is exerting, that is PCO2. How much pressure individually oxygen is exerting, that is PO2. Now, the direction of the gradient, if we see, oxygen always from the atmosphere it goes to the alveoli, then from the alveoli it goes to the blood, and from the blood it goes to the tissues. Okay. And for carbon dioxide, if we see, from the tissues it goes to the blood, and then blood to alveoli, then to atmosphere. This direction of gradient is very important. We will read it in more detail, but let us see some values now. Now we talked about what is partial pressure. Right now partial pressure of both oxygen and carbon dioxide is different with respect to the different environments. So if we see atmospheric air, that is the PO2 is 159. For carbon dioxide it is 0.3. In alveoli it is 104, and for oxygenated blood it is 95. For tissues it is 40, and for deoxygenated blood, if you see, partial pressure of oxygen is again 40. Why? Because tissues only will carry the deoxygenated blood will come from the tissues. So 159 in air, then it goes to alveoli, that is 104, then it goes to the blood. Okay, in blood it becomes 95. That blood which comes from the tissues, it will have a partial pressure of 40, and that is deoxygenated. So deoxygenated blood will also have 40 partial pressure. Then if we see carbon dioxide, partial pressure in the atmospheric air is 0.3, in alveoli it is 40, in blood it is deoxygenated, it is 45, oxygenated blood it is 40, and in the tissues it is 45. In the next slide you should be more clear with this. We'll just see what are the different things we will be covering first. Okay, then you have the diffusion membrane. Diffusion membrane is a respiratory membrane, that is the membrane across which the gases, both oxygen and the carbon dioxide, should pass. Now, in order for the diffusion to take place or the gas molecules to pass through the membrane, what should be the criteria? The membrane should be very thin. So here the membrane is less than 1 millimeter thickness, okay, and it comprises of 3 layers: squamous epithelium of the alveoli, endothelium of the alveolar capillaries, and basement membrane, that is located between two membranes. It consists the basement membrane of epithelium as well as basement membrane of endothelium. Okay, this is very, very important. We will see it more in detail in next slide. Let us see gases exchange in more detail now. In the atmosphere, partial pressure of oxygen is 159 and that of carbon dioxide is 0.3. As we inhale air and it passes through the conducting way to the alveolus, partial pressure of oxygen becomes 104 and for the carbon dioxide it becomes 40 millimeter of Hg. Now, if you see the tissues, they give the deoxygenated blood which is pumped to the heart, and heart pumps the deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary artery and it reaches near the alveoli inside the capillaries. Okay, so capillaries will contain deoxygenated blood which will be same as that of in the tissue. Okay, which is partial pressure of oxygen is 40 and partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45, because this will be the blood which is given by the tissues, so it will be same here. Okay, now let us see. If partial pressure of oxygen you see, then alveolus it is 104 and blood in the capillaries it will have 40. Now 104 partial pressure is more than 40, so oxygen will diffuse from the alveolus to the blood. Why? Because diffusion always takes from the higher concentration to the lower concentration, or higher partial pressure to the lower partial pressure. So oxygen partial pressure is more in the alveolus, less inside the blood in the capillaries. So oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood in the capillaries. So this is the direction of the oxygen diffusion. If you see carbon dioxide, partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolus is 40 and in the blood inside the capillary it is 45. So 45 is more than 40. So carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood in the capillaries towards the alveolus. So this is the direction of the diffusion of the carbon dioxide. Right? So this oxygenated blood is pumped is through the pulmonary vein to the heart and it is pumped to the different tissue parts. So we check the gases exchange at the primary site or alveolus. Let us now check at the tissue site. So as the blood is pumped, this oxygenated blood, if we see, it is carried away by the carried by the systemic artery. Now here the partial pressure of oxygen becomes 95 millimeter of Hg and partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 millimeter of Hg. Now tissue we already told, it is partial pressure is 40 millimeter of Hg and partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45 millimeter of Hg. Now if you see individually oxygen, so partial pressure inside the blood in systemic arteries, if you see, it is 95 and partial pressure in tissues it is 40. So 95 is more than 40. So oxygen will diffuse from the higher concentration, that is inside the systemic arteries or the blood vessels, to the tissue. So oxygen diffuses from the blood to the tissue. And for carbon dioxide, if you see, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the systemic arteries is 40 and in the tissue it is 45. So 45 is more than 45 is more than 40. So carbon dioxide will diffuse from the tissue towards the blood. Okay, so at the tissue side, this is how the diffusion will take place. Overall, if you see, oxygen from the atmosphere, it diffuses to the alveoli. Alveoli, from the alveoli diffuses to the blood, and from the blood it diffuses to the tissue. If you see carbon dioxide so diffusion of carbon dioxide takes place from the tissue to the blood, and from the blood it is transported to the alveolus, and from the alveolus it is diffuses to the atmosphere. This is a very, very important concept and you should be clear with this now. Okay, another important thing is the diagram of a section of an alveolus, what comprises of the diffusion membrane. So I told diffusion membrane is very thin, less than 1 millimeter, and it comprises of 3 parts. So what are the 3 parts? See, squamous, this is your alveolus. So the oxygen or carbon dioxide, it has to diffuse through 3 layers. This is the alveolus, this entire thing, this is the capillary. So what are the layers the gases have to cross? The first layer is the squamous epithelium of the alveolar wall, that is 1 cell thick. This is the squamous epithelium of the alveolar wall. Then another layer it will cross is the in between the capillary and the alveolus, there is the basement membrane for both the alveolar cavity and the endothelium, which is marked in yellow. So this also they have to cross. Then finally it has to cross to the endothelium of the blood capillary. So these are the 3 layers which the gases have to diffuse. So I hope you are very clear about the diffusion membrane. Okay, and the main these are the PYQ tags from which questions are asked, mostly from diffusion factor, components of diffusion membrane, reason based question like why oxygen diffuses and in which direction. Okay, what is the direction of carbon dioxide diffusion, why it happens like that. Table based questions like what are the partial pressures in oxygenated blood, deoxygenated blood, alveoli, tissue, all that you have to remember. Then also reason for faster carbon dioxide diffusion, that we already discussed. It is more soluble, 20 to 25 times more soluble. Okay, so these are the important areas from which questions are asked. I hope you are clear about this concept. Let us move on to the next topic. Let us now discuss how blood can act as a transport medium for carrying gases, both oxygen and carbon dioxide. If we talk about oxygen, 97% of it is transported by RBC and 3% it is dissolved in the plasma. It's a physical process. For carbon dioxide, if we see, 20 to 25% is transported by RBC, 70% is transported as bicarbonate ions, and 7% is physically dissolved in plasma. Why 7% it is more? We already know carbon dioxide more solubility in blood, 20 to 25% more than that of oxygen. Now, okay, the oxygen is carried by the RBC, but how? In the RBC we have a red colored pigment that is an iron containing pigment. It is called as hemoglobin. This is responsible for carrying the oxygen. One molecule of hemoglobin can bind to 4 molecules of oxygen and it can form oxyhemoglobin. This binding of oxygen and hemoglobin, this is reversible in nature. Why reversible is required? Look, where in the lungs we need the oxygen to be carried, so it in the blood, so it needs to bind to the hemoglobin. But what about the tissue side? We now need the oxygen to be delivered, so it needs to be dissociated. So if the like if the reaction between, if the binding of oxygen and hemoglobin is not reversible, we cannot load and unload oxygen from hemoglobin. That's why the binding is reversible in nature. The different factors that affect the binding of oxygen with hemoglobin are partial pressure of oxygen, which is the primary factor. Other factors are partial pressure of carbon dioxide, H plus or hydrogen ion concentration, and temperature. Now, if we plot a graph of, in the x-axis, if we take the partial pressure of oxygen, increasing concentrations of oxygen or increasing partial pressure of oxygen, then in y-axis if we take the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen, then that means how much uh, hemoglobin is able to bind to the oxygen, then we can get a S-shaped curve. This is called as oxygen dissociation curve. This curve is known as oxygen dissociation curve, and it helps to study the effect of partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hydrogen plus concentration, and temperature. That is how the different factors affect the binding of oxygen and hemoglobin, or how much concentration or partial pressure of oxygen is required for saturating the hemoglobin with oxygen. To study that, we need this graph. Okay, we will study it in little more detail in the next slide. Now what happens if you see at the alveoli, there is high concentration of oxygen and low concentration of carbon dioxide, low H plus and low temperature. All these conditions favor the binding of oxygen with hemoglobin at the alveoli. But at the tissue level, there is low PO2 or low partial pressure of oxygen, high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, high H plus concentration, and high temperatures. All these conditions favor the dissociation of oxygen from hemoglobin. So these factors are very important. You should remember what helps in the formation of oxyhemoglobin and what conditions favor the dissociation of oxygen from hemoglobin. Is that clear? Let's look at these points in a little more detail. Let us now discuss the oxygen dissociation curve in detail. Now, in the x-axis, you have partial pressure of oxygen. In the y-axis, you have percentage saturation of hemoglobin, or how much oxygen is combining or binding with hemoglobin. Okay, we get a S shape or a sigmoid curve for the same. Now, if you see at the lungs or the alveoli, remember the figures. Partial pressure of oxygen is 104 millimeter of Hg and partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 millimeter of Hg. Additionally, there is low H plus. Why? Because carbon dioxide is not forming a lot of bicarbonate, so there is low H plus ion concentration, and low temperature because the airway has caused a cooling or a moistening of the air as it has come through it into the alveolar sac. So air is moist, that has made the temperature low. So because the partial pressure of oxygen is primarily more than that of the carbon dioxide, in addition to the other factors of low H plus and low temperature and low PCO2, all these factors lead to the greater binding of the oxygen to the hemoglobin. So more oxygen is binding to the hemoglobin, so the graph shifts towards the left. Okay, left shift towards left shift shows higher binding of oxygen and hemoglobin. At the tissue level, if you see, the partial pressure of oxygen is 40 and that of carbon dioxide is, it is 45. So partial pressure of carbon dioxide is more than that of the oxygen. Additionally, there is high H plus because of the bicarbonate ion presence and high temperature. So all these factors lead to the dissociation of the oxygen with the hemoglobin. So oxygen dissociates from hemoglobin and uh, oxygen can be released to the tissues. So these dependence on the different factors and the red uh, and the right and the left shift, it is known as the Bohr's effect. Okay. We looked into the transport of oxygen through blood. Let us now see the transport of carbon dioxide in more detail. Carbon dioxide, typically there are three ways in which it can be transported. 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide is transported as carbaminohemoglobin, that is binding of carbon dioxide with hemoglobin. The most important way is through bicarbonate ions, which transports about 70% of carbon dioxide, and 7% of carbon dioxide is dissolved in the plasma. Now, what leads to the formation of this carbaminohemoglobin complex? This binding typically depends upon the high PCO2 or high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which is the most important factor, and low PO2, that is another factor. So if you see at the tissues level, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is very high, and this leads to the binding of the carbon dioxide with the hemoglobin. Now at the alveoli level, if you see, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is less, so dissociation of carbon dioxide and hemoglobin takes place, or dissociation of the carbaminohemoglobin complex takes place. Okay. The second method of transport through bicarbonate ions, it involves an important enzyme, that is carbonic anhydrase. This carbonic anhydrase enzyme, where is it present? It is present in the red blood cells or RBCs. Okay, minute amount is also present in the plasma. The site at which carbonic anhydrase is present is very important, and this carbonic anhydrase catalyzes the reaction, that is CO2 plus H2O gives rise to H2CO3, and which again forms the bicarbonate plus H plus ion. Now here, this is very important because if we see at tissue level where partial pressure of carbon dioxide is very high, why? Because there's a lot of catabolism, respiration has taken place, so we have more carbon dioxide concentration. So this high carbon dioxide concentration leads to the formation of H2CO3. Okay, and hence this H2CO3 leads to the formation of bicarbonate ions, and H plus ions are also released. But if you see at the alveolar level, so at the alveolar level, carbon dioxide concentration, partial pressure is less. So where will be the reaction tend to? The reaction will at the equilibrium will always tend to the side where it is less. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is less, so it will try to make it more. So the bicarbonate ions, that will again convert to H2CO3 and dissociate finally to carbon dioxide and water. So at the alveolar level, this carbon dioxide can be released out. Is that clear? So carbon dioxide is trapped as bicarbonate at the tissue level and transported to the alveoli and released out as carbon dioxide. This is a very important tagline. Okay. There is something called as carbon dioxide delivery capacity, which is 100 milliliter of deoxygenated blood. If you see, it delivers about 4 milliliter of carbon dioxide to the alveoli. Okay, that is also very important. You need to remember. Okay, so that's all about transport of carbon dioxide. I hope you are clear about it. So let's see the regulation of respiration. Respiration is a very complex process and it needs to be regulated because we need a constant level of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. This regulation is of two types: neural or the nervous regulation and chemosensitive or chemical regulation. Neural regulation has two components in it: respiratory rhythm center and pneumotaxic center. This respiratory rhythm center is present in the medulla oblongata, and it is responsible for the basic rhythm generation. And pneumotaxic center, it is present in the pons, and it is responsible for modifying the rhythm as well as the rate. Now, coming to chemosensitive area, this chemosensitive area, it is present near the respiratory rhythm center in the medulla oblongata, and it is under the central chemoreceptor. It can detect the high carbon dioxide concentration and high H plus ion concentration in the blood, and it signals to the respiratory rhythm center to which again signals the respiratory muscles. So lungs can stretch, okay, and breathing can increase because of the process, okay. We also have peripheral chemoreceptors that are present in the aortic body and the carotid body, and they can also detect the carbon dioxide and H plus ion concentration. To summarize the regulation of respiration, we have medulla, in which we have the respiratory rhythm center. It is for the primary control and making the rhythm. Also, we have the pons, which is the secondary regulation system, and it modifies the rhythm and the rate. Okay, this is your neural regulation. Under the chemosensitive regulation, we have the central chemoreceptors. We can sense the carbon dioxide and H plus present in the present next to the respiratory rhythm center. Also, we have the peripheral chemoreceptor, which is present in the aortic body and the carotid body. Oxygen plays an insignificant role in the regulation of respiration process. I hope this part is clear for you. So we have come to the final part of the chapter, that is the disorders of respiratory system. We have three main types of respiratory disorders: asthma, which is characterized by difficulty in breathing and causes wheezing. Okay, this is due to inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. Okay, now here you should pay importance to the cause and the symptoms. Directly fact-based question comes: wheezing is due to inflammation of bronchioles, not alveoles. So you should remember bronchi and bronchiole inflammation causes asthma. Similarly, emphysema, if you see, emphysema is a chronic respiratory disorder in which alveolar walls are damaged and the respiratory surface is decreased. Question often confuses: is the respiratory surface is increased or it is like bronchioles are affected? Okay, so you should remember that alveolar walls are damaged here and respiratory surface is decreased, and typically it is due to the cigarette smoking. Okay, third type of disorder is an occupational respiratory disorder. It is seen in the industries, generally grinding, stone breaking, and because of the dust produced long term, it causes the fibrosis or proliferation of the fibrous tissue in the lung, and workers, they should wear a protective mask in order to safeguard themselves. Okay, so the one liner you can remember: asthma is bronchi inflammation, emphysema is alveolar damage, and dust causes fibrosis, right? So with this, we finish the session today, and we discussed in detail all the important concepts with the mind maps, diagrams, and PYQ tags. I hope you enjoyed the session today. If you like the session, please do like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and I'll be coming up with the more one-shot videos. See you guys very soon. Have a very good day.